Welcome to another 90s and Noughties Roundtable. This time we're talking CBBC continuity, following up a year on from our CITV continuity chat. I'm joined by Robin, who was part of that conversation, and Tim, who's been on the podcast before. Welcome to both of you. Robin, does the continuity of CBBC start back in 1985? Am I right there with Philip Schofield?
Envision it did, because before that it was done just like any other shows on BBC One with a very formal sounding announcer. They did sort of jazz it up in the early to mid 80s with computer graphics of a BBC Micro, which became sort of a template for children. September 85 was when it started proper under its own umbrella, because ITV had been doing it for 2.5 years beforehand. And only that Children's BBC was done live with a presenter in Vision, and Philip Schofield was the person they brought in to launch it all. It very nearly didn't go that way. I think he was hired at the last minute because he just got back from a few years in New Zealand. They were probably going to get cast members of Grange Hill to do it, but thank goodness it ended up as it was.
Well, that's quite interesting, the cast members of Grange Hill, because I've been rewatching. I know it's nothing to do with the BBC, it's more the other side. That stars from the shows were continuity announcers on CITV in the mid-1980s.
Yeah, I've never thought of it that way. That might have been what they were trying to do, doing exactly what ITV were doing, yeah.
But it worked out better because you got the iconic, the broom cupboard became iconic. It became part of a parcel of British children's television in the 1980s and early 1990s. It became a bit of a brand itself, and then you had the successes for these presenters. Philip Schofield is on loads of programs on ITV now, and obviously went on to do Going Live. Andy Peters later with Live and Kicking. So it sort of worked as a nice springboard for these presenters, especially within the early to mid-90s.
Nobody cared if it went wrong. That's why. And they liked seeing it all done off the cuff. In fact, the term the broom cupboard, I think, came about by accident, because one day they had to do it in a smaller continuity studio, which was smaller than the one that they had, I think, in the BBC's press department. And they just stuck with the name the broom cupboard, and they applied it to wherever they presented, provided it was not one of the bigger ones like they did for the birthdays and summer strands like BFT and what have you. Became the home to it later on.
Yeah, well, my memories of CBBC, I would have been a baby when the broom cupboard was had. But interesting fact, it actually was always told, and might even find it in my baby photos, that I had an Ed the Duck birthday cake. This was when Andy Peters was a CBBC continuity announcer. My earliest memories probably would be around 95, 96, but I was only really... Well, interestingly, I remember when I was probably a toddler in preschool, and even into the year reception in primary school, I always remember having CITV on, so seeing all the programs like your Zaps and your How-Tos, and Big Bang was around. But it was into like this, I think what really sort of started it off with me, the BBC had this fantastic cross-network rebrand in 1997, where we saw the balloon and the implementation of Gil Sands.
I mean, it was done a lot better than the most recent one, which...
Oh, of course, yeah. Well, I miss Gil Sands already, but just the whole thing with the balloon idents and the using it into the news and then into the sports, and sort of like, and then it was into CBBC. I remember when it was known as Children's BBC, I would have probably caught bits of the Saturday Aardvark. Unfortunately, for ITV, I never watched MASH or Scratchy and Co. I just watched the...
well, they weren't very good anyway. In fact, they still, until Ant and Dec came along, the BBC, even if it was just Kirsten and Otis in Prez A linking programmes, it still managed to knock ITV dead, even in the summer.
Yeah, and it just became sort of natural for me to just watch CBBC. And I think it was like... I remember probably partially throughout the autumn of 1996 was probably still have CITV on, but it was only really the summer of 97. And then after watching the breakfast show, which actually I even watched that, I was more often watching that other than the Big Breakfast, weirdly enough, which is like, but it's just one of the things when you're 6, 7, 8. I would watch, it just ended up being CBBC until about 2000, when everyone was talking about Pokemon, and SMTV Live was the talk of playground. Live and Kicking was in the decline. The Jamie and Zoe Live and Kicking was brilliant, but then Steve and Emma, it just wasn't working out. It was sort of losing me a little bit. And then around 1999, Pokemon was on, and then it was on SMTV, and SMTV were doing better material real with Ant and Dec.
I sort of cottoned on to it because SMTV ran the whole summer, and it was funny, and word of mouth spread it around, and that's why I think CBBC lost a lot of confidence as a whole, because I mean, it was around, you mentioned the big rebrand of 97, and they changed all the ideas from some really amazing sort of both CGI and stop motion animations. You just had hand-drawn stuff or looked like it on black and yellow. And I just thought, this is a bit babyish. It would suit CBeebies, to be perfectly honest. This is years before it started. But from discussions I've seen on the recently relaunched, I think the TV Live forum, there are some rather ridiculous. And this is just, you can have like your opinions on certain periods, but you remember times really fondly. But when it comes back to an argument to bring back my childhood, there was like the suggestion that it should all go back to how it was pre-late 2001, because that's the period you went, that's not a good argument. But yeah.
Well, it's like, I liked those yellow, sort of yellow and black idents and all that. But then sometimes I've always had this sort of bias towards 1998 to 2002.
It's when like, you grow up, the earliest memories you have of growing up.
Yeah, it's just one of those things. It's not really well thought in a way.
Because my memories of it go back a little bit further. I think the earliest memory would be Andy Crane in the Broom Cupboard. I think Philip Schofield would have been doing Going Live, but they'd also branched off into Summer Strand's Lightbutts First Fist, but went out on weekday mornings where they'd normally be daytime shows during term time. The whole morning would be given to children's BBC, and even if the shows were just repeats, it was still exciting because you had this linking to a show within a show intertwining other shows, and it got even more so on Sunday mornings when between October and February of the new year, the Open University would be on holiday. So you have this big strand of programs on a Sunday morning from 7:30 until midday, and the graphics then and the idents were a bit more brash, and I think they had a CGI face with a great big top hat over 2D. You can see it on I think in the Ravensburg archive, got BBC Graphics Past, and it looked as if it was aimed at more older viewers. I was only about 4, but it's what I aspired it to be. And when they changed it, I think to be yellow and black idents, I thought, well, I'm too old for this. And around the time one of the former presenters, Andy Peters, had just launched T4 on Channel 4. And I thought, this is more me. But I find myself returning to CBBC around about 2002 when they launched the digital channels. And because CBBC was split from CBeebies, they could be a bit more older. They could be a bit more sort of tongue-in-cheek. And it was very exciting.
Yeah, because I was in high school and I actually went back to watching CBBC because I never was really into Dick and Dom. I was actually more of a Ministry of Mayhem kind of person.
I've been watching all of those back on YouTube. I'm not up to November yet, but I watched, I think, one this morning from around August. It was only 40 minutes long because of the Grand Prix, and all you had was a game of Ram Ray and this play your cards right knockoff to get two people wanting to get in to see the Chelsea versus Arsenal game the next day. But so it's my memory. It proves my memories of that might be a bit rose tinted, but Dick and Dom, they did make me laugh. But again, I think they got a bit too. They started to like focus more on like the adult viewers. It got a bit too self-indulgent at times, and I think when it got moved to BBC Two towards the end, that knocked them back a bit more, and it started getting funny again towards the end.
Yeah, but then they decommissioned it, and in the autumn of 2006, we had the Mighty Truck of Stuff, which I'm probably one of a few people who might remember it, and I don't know how.
I liked the Mighty Truck of Stuff. I really did think that would be the next, because it was meant to be on for the summer. It stopped in July, and I thought, oh, it will come back in the autumn. It just needs time to breathe. And then on the Chris Moyle show, the day after the final Top of the Pops, Reggie Yates, who was standing in for, I think it was JK and John Early Breakfast, said that it had finished. It wasn't coming back. And I thought, oh no, it's and because they thought that Sam and Mark were a more worthy proposition on Saturday mornings. And their show, for me, it was just trying to be Ant, Dec and Cat. I mean, bless Caroline Flack, but not as good. It was just another generic Saturday morning show. Nothing that was that original.
It just didn't have that sort of feel to it. I remember enjoying watching it, but it felt a bit too... it was the same things were happening again, but I don't think the magic was there. And for the Saturday morning show,
then I was at university, so I'd have been too old for it anyway. But
I was
go on to.
I was still in high school at the time, so
fair enough.
It's just with that, it felt like, and it's sort of like what with Dick and Dom, the issue with it. I think if it was on in the midweek, I would have really liked it. It's just like, for me, a Saturday morning show has to have that formula that.
Yeah.
It needs to be studio, guests, audience.
Well, I think Dick and Dom's problem with it was when they did get celebrity guests on it, it was fun for when it was the comic release specials, and they did go out during the daytime, even on BBC Two at 6 p.m, which may have been a testing bed for that shambolic revival of Ask the Family.
Ask the Family, yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to have a few words about Jamie? You sound like you remember it.
Well, I remember Ask the Family, and I always remember them flashing back to the original episodes and it looking quite dry compared to what Dick and Dom were trying to do. But I think they were trying to bridge them between sort of children's and adults TV, I guess.
It was a disaster. Even Dick and Dom themselves admitted, I think it was on an interview on LBC when it was still broadcasting into London only, that they said it was the biggest part of TAT we'd ever done. And
I remember quite enjoying it because
some of it made me laugh, but after 2 weeks, because it was still being filmed when the first episodes went out, it got a bit more tame. They sort of toned it down, and it was worse than it was. And it may have worked if I wrote this on a blog a few years ago, but it would have worked better if it was shown in CBBC. But when you stick it on BBC Two and the old slot that The Simpsons used to be in, no, it didn't work.
I mean, there's a lot of presenters from CBBC that have crossed over into the adult sphere.
Yeah, well, at the same time.
But Dick and Dom and Sam and Mark just haven't been able to make that transition over.
They admitted that they didn't necessarily want to. And I mean, Sam and Mark are still doing Crackerjack, which is produced by Steve Wright, who produced The Bungalow and used to be the Out of Vision CITV presenter in the 90s, which even he will happily joke about.
But it's interesting because Dick and Dom were, this goes before Studio 9. They were starting out doing all sorts of strands and even doing things together in the 1990s. So, and then 10 years later, like you look at Holly Willoughby, by 10 years after she was doing Ministry of Mayhem, she was doing This Morning.
Yeah.
And all
shorter than that. I think it was 3 years after the Ministry or Saturday Showdown as it became finished, she was hosting This Morning, yeah.
But some really still found a place in children's TV, and Dick and Dom are that classic example. And now we've got Sam and Mark, who they're doing a pretty good job with Crackerjack, and it's doing well bringing it back and all that. I
mean, I didn't think it was going to work. I'm a bit old for it, but they have it. But because it has a set of really good producers and a supporting cast, it does do its job. And it's never going to get the big viewing figures that a show like Live and Kicking or The Bungalow did in its prime, but because there's so many distractions. But it's still, I think it's one of a few of a certain style of television that still survives. And
it's one of many revivals that they've done over the past sort of 15 years or so, isn't it? I remember Basil Brush's Swap Shop, which was a little bit bizarre. Do you remember that? That was bizarre.
I remember Basil Brush's show. I thought Basil Brush's show was pretty good. But the Swap Shop didn't work out. And it was at a part where Saturday morning TV was pretty much phased out. I think the coughing was really nailed after ITV gave up, or you could probably even say when
they thought, if they're not trying, why should we? And the show only lasted an hour long. Even TMI was shortened to half its length around that time. I mean, the Basil Swap Shop, that was by the same people who did Ministry of Mayhem. And I actually, on a visit to, when I did a work placement at ITV Meridian in their newsroom, I went round the studios and into the very studio where we were shooting what I think was the final series, which was Basil and Barney's Swap Shop, even though Barney did all 3 series, but they put his name at the front of it. He went on to do pretty well hosting Blue Peter after, which is a rather odd transition considering he'd done Envision presentation and Saturday morning shows. But yeah, that was quite weird.
Some may say that early 10s it became Barney Harwood Central, the CBBC channel, because he did something called Prank Patrol, which was
that was
TMI.
It was an American show, but they, I think, retooled over here.
Yeah.
But even as far back as Going Live, they introduced Double Dare, which is from Nickelodeon. And there are elements, I've seen both the American version and one over here. I've actually repeated Double Dare within BFT during the summer because it was a 20-minute segment. We thought we could take that out, show it over the summer daily, and it did work pretty well.
I remember Run the Risk, but also another thing
came out after Double Dare, yeah.
But I do remember it was after The Simpsons. It was around 1998. Hit, Miss or Maybe was actually repeated on the Death 2 stand in 98.
That stem back to the prop panel on Saturday Superstore. They'd done it in different forms. They had Trevor and Simon doing it on Live and Kicking as a video gold mine, video galleon. But when they just went back to a straight format and Hit, Miss or Maybe. But they took that out of Live and Kicking, repeated it.
Yeah.
And the same with the Electric Circus magazine, yeah.
Wasn't that Zoe Ball?
Zoe did Hit, Miss or Maybe. I think they had a rotating list of presenters for Electric Circus, yeah.
I remember when they had the second incarnation where they brought in all 4 presenters of Live and Kicking and Carrie Forst and the theme song. They retooled those segments, and instead of Electric Circus, you had Star, and instead of had the quiz was called Popaholics.
Oh, there was a great bit on that, which, I mean, because they upped sticks to Scotland, it was going to run all year round, but they moved it to Scotland towards the end. But before they could even move up there, it got axed. Mel B was a guest on there, and Trey Farley was doing these innuendo-laden introductions that were rhyming couplets. And he would stop before he'd say a certain word, but Mel B hasn't quite got the gist of it. And DJ Pied Piper was one of the guests. I think the rhyme went, if Sarah Teams wins, I'm sure he'll thank her. But if I judge he loses, he'll call me a... And then Mel B just shouted the expletive out on live.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that on YouTube, yeah. It was within a segment where they split the show into 3 parts. They had kicking tunes, then the main Live and Kicking, and then Live and Loud with Popaholics. And I think, and I've noticed that CBBC tried to go through the route of what CITV were doing, but CITV were doing it since 1996, the music show, after the main Razzmatazz with Top of the Pops.
Back in around about, I mean, one of the things that Andy Peters did after he left Live and Kicking was he moved to LWT for their youth department. And there was a show that went out after the main show on ITV he did called The Noise, which I never saw the point of. You have that and then the ITV chart show afterwards, which was long established and it was better. And you wonder what the point of Andy Peters' show was because it was only half an hour long. But no, with them splitting Live and Kicking into 3 segments, they had the tagline, one great show, 3 times as kicking.
Well, it was more around the autumn of 2002, because I did see there was the first series of a Saturday show, which completely didn't work. You got presenters from The Word and someone at Radio 1 on the way to transition to Radio 2, presenting a kids' Saturday morning show. It's like they could have just got Johnny Vaughan and Denise Van Houten on that. But more to the point is they revamped the Saturday show and made it a bit more to its roots, a bit more Live and Kicking-y. And then they had Top of the Pop Saturday. So I thought ITV are having success with, well, up until then, because they had...
I can remember watching one Saturday morning around that time, both shows had a pop panel style item reviewing videos. And I thought, things have to change, and that's why I think it was right for them to bring Dick and Dom into Bungalow, because it was already on the CBBC show. They promoted the Saturday edition onto BBC One. It was the right thing to do. Although Top of a Pop Saturday actually stayed put, but in a completely different format to when it was live.
It became Reloaded, and then you had the sports spin-off with Jake Humphries to Newsride called Sports Round.
Yeah, that was a bit later on. Yeah,
it's sort of, the dynamics were changing by the mid-noughties. You couldn't just have this 80s and 90s going live and kicking. You had to adapt. You had to see why you're getting battered by the other side, because then they had it.
But this is when I was starting university, around spring 2006, there was this big review, The Creative Future, and it's talked about a lot there's this great book, I don't know if you could still buy it, by the former editor of Blue Peter, Richard Marson, called The Blue Peter Diaries, which he is very outspoken about the plans to reduce the age bracket for CBBC to between 6 and 12 years old. And his thoughts, so that if anyone's older than 12, they're told to naff off, they're not welcome anymore. And this is when things started to change with presentation, because in December of that year, they ditched Studio 9 after almost 10 years, and they moved it into a virtual reality studio, which lasted.
That was awful. That was awful. Do you know what it reminds me of?
Yeah.
TeleQuest.
Oh God, TeleQuest! I mentioned it. It looks exactly. I've actually quite fondness for the virtual studio, because it's a classic example of a presenter being able to make the best out of a rubbish situation. I thought Gemma Hunt was actually, I'd have her on my list as one of my favorite CBBC presenters, because it made it more personable. But no, TeleQuest, that was terrible. And I've mentioned it on before. That had, I think, a sweary moment on there, which I've not seen. I'd love to have seen it, but oh God, but whoever made that phone call was right.
Virtual studios are not a bad thing, because in 1993, the BBC News did it, and then a few years later, Grandstand had it with Final Score, and they had this weird studio which was like you were inside a giant football for Football Focus, things like that.
Oh, Football Focus, yes, I remember that.
Things like that work, and then nowadays the News has one to an extent, but you've got like the Match of the Day studio where they made it into a stadium. That works really well. That is how you do a virtual studio, like the Newsroom at Night 3 or Match of the Day.
I do get that not many people viewed that period of CBBC fondly, but it came the change to The Office with Ed and Archer. That came around the time when I was in hospital for 3 weeks. So when I went, and we had a television in the main communal area, and I can remember seeing the new look just days before I got let out, and I thought, oh, they changed it all of a sudden. And there was no InVision presentation on BBC One or BBC Two, which is down to budget cuts. And what with Biker Grove being out the year before, Grange Hill laxed the year after, there was nowhere for teens to go, and they introduced this half-baked strand called BBC Switch that was shunted on a Saturday afternoon around this very time, around 4 p.m. All they had was a Canadian soap import and a music magazine Sound, which it seems hard to believe now, but it was the only magazine of its sort aimed at teenagers on television, because Top of the Pops had finished the year before, CD UK a few months earlier. Even Pop World had finished after Simon Amstel and Makita had gone, and the replacements, Alex and Alexa, just weren't living up to scratch.
Yeah, that's interesting. That, and one thing I did feel when I knew that was a look on way, because I was on TV Forum quite a bit. But one thing I sort of looked, and it made me think, I was so glad I was a certain age. I was the age to be a child from the late 90s to the mid noughties, because we had these wonderful things like the InVision Press. And one thing I noticed, I felt CBBC as well as CITV, definitely. I felt if you had a satellite dish in the noughties, it was around in the 90s, but I felt it was a definite must-have to watch good television was a satellite dish by 2007. And I felt, well, I don't think CBBC could compete, whatever they do, against Cartoon Network, against Jetix.
We did have some good shows.
They still
even
did.
when The Office, yeah, it's still to this day. But when The Office relaunched, I can remember still recovering from what happened that led me to be a hospital. There were two shows, but I had to watch. One was the Sarah Jane Adventures, and the other was Shoot, which is by the same people who did Dick and Dom. But it was basically showing a load of clips from old comedy by a man trapped in a BBC basement filled with videotapes.
Oh, yeah.
That was quite surreal, but it was really funny. And
that sounds like one of the greatest shows ever.
No, you're right. I've been watching a few of them back, and some of them make me laugh.
Yeah, but it was interesting. I just felt that still seems to be going strong. But I just think that the CBBC, they started knowing that they were in the shadow of Disney Channel, all the big kids shows, and it was at a time when it was reported on the news at the time that there was all this talk about British television commissions for children being at a low point, and everything saying everything. And I just thought, well, everything's coming in from America and to an extent Japan, and it's all on your satellite channels and stuff. But then I was 15 by 2007, and it was probably, for me, I'd sort of grown out of it. And
well, I was 10 years older than the cutoff point by 2007. I was 22. And it was up to 12 years old. I thought maybe I'm a bit too old for this now. And and if I wasn't finding what Ed and Atcha are getting up to in the Office that funny, I wasn't supposed to. There are some bits that were funny, I think, with a photo of Adolf Hitler, which I think is on YouTube, that really made me laugh. But no, I did prefer the more one-to-one style of the virtual studio than The Office, because everything had to be a comedy set. You can't be funny all the time. You have to learn to find a place where to play it straight at times, balance that. Because if you try to be funny all the time, the joke will wear thin and you end up becoming annoying. It's that's just my opinion. I wouldn't force that on anyone else, because you do see on discussion boards and forums, people will force their opinions on other people. They'll get very angry if you disagree with them.
Even though you might not think, and I think differently, that the yellow and black idents were particularly good, I actually thought that was probably the best era. And I think that was always the winning formula, because you had your presenters, and it was similar to what Stephen and Danielle was doing, but you could relate, the delivery and the sort of freedom that your Michael Underwoods, your Kirstens, your Steve Wilsons, and your Adrian Dixons had. It worked. Liam Dolan. It worked for them. Anna Bolter. It just worked fine. It could flow, and then you had the puppetry, which wasn't too in your face in 1998.
I just think it was there for too long. For me, it was there for a very long time. A bit like the Top of the Pops of that era, when Chris Carey was producing it with the Led Zeppelin. It stayed like that, even if they did change it to a 3D title. But it stayed like that for well over 4 years. And when the change came, it was long overdue, even if I think CBBC probably fared better than Top of the Pops did when it got revamped.
But just sum it up, I just liked I was too young to remember Broom Club, but I just liked the big studio, because I felt like they could do whatever they want, and there was no pressure. Oh, you have to be funny. You have to be funny. No, you just be Richard McCaw. You just be Dominic Wood. You be Kirsten O'Brien. You be Michael Underwood. You just do that and deliver and have a bit of fun.
What do you think, Robin, to sum up?
In short, it might be the thing that was most influential on an interest in television and broadcasting as a whole. I still look back at our presentation from all those eras, whether it be the yellow and black periods, the Bugs, or even the Broom Cupboard. It's very influential. It's just really inspiring, and so many great broadcasters came out of it.
Yeah, I'm in agreement, although I was watching the other side. Sorry.